Me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion, with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building. Globespan believes that every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diasporas and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
Coffee and Dr. Jagan, Bobby, she gave us our great sons. Rohan Kanhai, Coffee and Dr. Jagan.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adopt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
Me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with our technical operator, Mr. Devin Dissoon, joining us tonight as usual. Tonight we are discussing the PPP, ruling incumbent PPP, People's Progressive Party Congress, that took place last weekend in Guyana. We'll be discussing it and the future of Guyana. Coinciding with the PPP's Congress is Indian Arrival Day. One can also say it's Indian Arrival or Arrival Month in Guyana, May being the period when many Indians came to Guyana and in other countries as well. We will focus first on the discussion on Indian Arrival Day in Guyana. Joining us for this discussion on both topics are Professor Betram Ramarak and Mr. Ravindra Dev, neither of whom is a stranger to this program, having appeared over years many times. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for viewing, watching us, hearing us this evening. Let's first begin with Indian Arrival Day. What is Indian Arrival Day and why is it being celebrated? If we could ask Professor Ramarak.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Please, we are hearing you clear.
Okay. Well, you know, when we think of Indian Arrival Day, we're looking at a historic event, right? Which contributes to a multicultural society, which we call Guyana. We're going back to a situation where slavery ended, slavery was abolished, and so there was a great need for labor. So that labor shortage was now being provided by laborers from India, not just India. You know, there were also Portuguese who came as indentured. There were also Chinese who came as indentured. But the bulk of those indentured, and some of them also came from Africa, by the way, but the bulk of those indentured were Indians, right? And essentially they were brought to work in the sugar plantations, as I guess everybody in Guyana would know. But I do want to emphasize the fact that this was a turning point. It was a historical event for Indians. There were attempts in India to stop the movement because they were concerned that Indians were being ill-treated in the colonies and so on. Again, I'm jumping all the way to the early 1900s, right? So it's not just Guyana. Indians were taken, you know, they signed a contract, which we call the Girmit. Gandhi used the word Girmit. So we use the word Girmitia to refer to those folks who came, right? The indentured who came primarily from Bihar and UP, not all of them from those two states. Some of them also came from the South, right? The Tamils. So that was a 5-year contract. Some of them renewed the contract. And some eventually returned to India, but the bulk of the people who came stayed, right? So Guyana was actually, if I can give you some numbers here, we're looking at 1838, right? So that would be 186 years of being there. Neighboring Trinidad in 1845, Suriname 1873, and then you can move on to Jamaica 1845 again. But the point is, that vacuum, that labor vacuum was, was now filled by those Indian immigrants who came. So when we talk about Indian arrival day or indentured Indians, we're thinking of that specific event, right? Now, there are some discussions, and I've been engaged in one of them today, where the idea that people could celebrate leaving India is an oxymoron because people suffered, right? Now, I'm not comparing indentureship to folks, who were enslaved or enslaved Africans. It's a different system. And of course, we know we were contracted. Some of us had some, the right to go back to India and so on, which is different. But nevertheless, it was a brutal system, a system of control, right? So the brutality was there. So my point is, you're not necessarily celebrating Indian Arrival Day. You can commemorate it, right? Some people will celebrate because when they look at the history, they will make the argument that, well, life is much better in the colonies, or it became much better, and they're happy that they left India. But the point is, there is that historical connection. So you can commemorate, you can celebrate, or whatever. And our beef, if I can use the word beef today, is that the word Indian has been removed from Indian Arrival Day, right? Which is a day that is commemorated in all of the other areas that I mentioned, Trinidad, Suriname, and the other places where Indians were taken. So that's one of the, I guess, the discussions we have engineered, and we have been talking about this, and it has become a sort of a ritual repetition. That the question is, if Indians who came primarily in the month of May, the first two ships, that is, the Portuguese, I believe, came in the same month, why not call May 5th that historical day when for the first time in the diaspora, two ships leaving on different days, but landed on the same day, right? So I will not say Arrival Day, I will say Indian Arrival Day if I'm referring to that specific event.
So, Mr. Ravindra Dev, as Dr. Ramrak pointed out, the Indians came, the Africans came before them, the Portuguese came, the Chinese, Africans also came as indentured laborers. Why is this day important? I mean, why are we observing, commemorating, celebrating this historic day of May 5th? Is it that important to celebrate, observe, commemorate?
Well, whatever word we want to use, and that is left to the individual, when we start to agitate for it from the 80s onwards, we talked about Indian Arrival Day, and the reason for arrival, and this is critical, I think most people miss the point, that in before that it was called Indian Immigration Day. Going back to the 60s, it was called Indian Immigration Day. And even in 1838, at the centenary of the arrival, where it was commemorated, it was seen as an immigration day. But when one speaks of arrival, the individual, we are now taking charge. We are assuming agency over how we look at our own history. Because arrival tells you have arrived somewhere. In one sense, that's one meaning of the word arrival. The other meaning of the word arrival would be, why did you leave where you departed from? Why? And have you therefore arrived? So in one sense, it's geographical, but in another sense, it's aspirational. Why did the Indians leave India? And I think that is the critical point, because it will answer that question as to whether it ought to be celebrated or commemorated, or not even mentioned, let it just be silenced. So the point is that the British, since the Battle of Plessy in 1757 had conquered Bengal, which at that time included parts of Bihar and Jharkhand and what have you, when they conquered it, they began to rape it. The word loot is a Hindi word that entered the English language because that's what the Indians told them that they were doing. They were looting the country, and they literally looted the country. So, for instance, when one talks of the railways that the British developed in India, it wasn't to help India. It was to take the goods out of India to the ports to be transported. So when, again, you look at India, by the time 1838 rolls around, and we have the emigration of Indians to these foreign climes starting, India was a devastated country where famine had become endemic. And the irony of it was that the British, who were supposed to be so benign, they were, during these famines, in one case, when tens of millions were dying, yet they were shipping all the grains out of India. So when we left India, it was an India that was devastated. To say that those who left were poor is not a reflection of the people who left. It was a reflection of those who had conquered and ruled India to make it such that even before us departing across the Kalapani, we were migrating within India. You were migrating, you were looking everywhere for some way of sustaining body and soul. So that is the essence of arrival. So we left that India, and we then went somewhere, in this case, Guyana. And therefore the question arises, have we arrived? What did we leave? We left for security. Are we secure today? We left for economic betterment. Are we economically better off? And all the other questions that come off. So for instance, I'll leave you with this, that the very act of arrival, you came into a society that had been pretty much formed between the enslaved Africans and the Europeans, first the Dutch and the English. So they had worked out a modus vivendi as to how they coexisted. By the time 1838 rolled around, you had the so-called abolition. So they had a modus vivendi that they had worked out. So we were inserted into that system. So it is very important for them also, whom we encountered, to investigate and inquire and interrogate this day. What happened? And in fact, we are still facing the consequences of our arrival playing out in the political realm. Initially, it was in the economic realm. And if you look at the historians of African Guyanese going all the way right after slavery, they kept on complaining about these Indians who were brought in as indentured servants, and rightfully so, complained the fact that they were paying taxes, which helped to pay for those Indians to come in. It was like cutting you and rubbing some salt into the wound. So we cannot pretend that those things did not happen. And again, I say, therefore, the importance of commemorating this day is several-fold. One would be for the Indians themselves to reflect about what had happened to them in India. What were they expecting when they came to this new land called British Guyana? The other races in Guyana should also reflect as to why these people were brought. Did they come here willingly in terms of, if a man is burning your house and you have to jump out, are you jumping out willingly? Or is it an act of a reflexive self-defense? Those are all questions that I think ought to be interrogated on Indian Arrival Day. So it is not just for the Indians, it is for all the people of Guyana.
Well, thank you. Just for clarity, the first verse landed in Guyana in 1830. And we are Indians were enslaved just like every other group. And on that day, we are not celebrating, commemorating, observing, honoring enslavement. What we are doing is celebrating or commemorating our triumphs over persecution and enslavement. And we are also celebrating our survival. And in addition to that, the enormous contributions that the Indian community made to the respective territories to which they were indentured or enslaved. So that needs to be brought out very clearly, that because many times people make the statement, why are you celebrating your enslavement? We are not celebrating enslavement. We are celebrating our triumphs over persecution. Any other points you wish to make on a particular subject?
Well, yeah, you know, the other thing also, and I think this is more of a reaction, not just from, you know, from non-Indians. And again, I'm speaking as an Indian here who, you know, understands that part of our history, and I've spent some time, you know, looking at that. And one of the things I notice, even among Indians, is that when you talk about commemorating Indian Arrival Day, there seems to be an impression that you are now seeing, well, you know, your legacy, your connection with history is much more important. We're certainly not saying that, but we also can't tie our history based on what other people are doing with their history. Case in point is that when you look at Trinidad today, the Prime Minister Raouli made it very clear that you know you have to attach the word, you know, African to African emancipation, right? And that is important. Nobody should have a problem with that. So there should be no contradiction if Indians are talking about Indian Arrival Day, commemorate, celebrate, whatever you want to do, however you see fit. But I think it also brings out an important connection that we have, because they are still, you know, when you focus on that as a historical event, as I said, it motivates people to learn about their history and appreciate their history. So that means that, you know, you can now, as I think Jack Dale has done, the former, you know, PM of Trinidad, Pandey, and I think Kamla Bisesar, all of them have actually, and I believe Irfan Ali has done that too. They have looked at the immigration records and traced that history back and understand that connection with India. So it is a point in history where you can actually go back and maybe create a family tree, right? And you can look at that experience. And one of the things I can tell you that really, in a sense, it kind of motivated me to kind of focus on that experience is that we know a lot about what happened in India, you know, before those Girmitias boarded the ships. We know a lot about what happened when they came into Guyana, when they came to those plantations. We can use the word, you know, Jahaji, but I think that it's a good word to use, but I think that Jahaji, because of its connection with the ships, it doesn't encompass the entire experience that goes beyond the ship. That's why I'm saying Girmitia includes the contract and the plantation experience and so on. So there is still that black hole for many of us. In other words, what was life like on those ships, right? That lasted 90 days, 111 days, and so on, especially the earlier ships. So that's an interesting part of our history. So when we talk about Indian Arrival Day, my point is it does motivate us, you know, to look at that history, to understand that historical development, you know, that is part and parcel of us, right? And the other thing, the point that I try to make earlier is that looking at what your history is like and commemorating that day, it doesn't make you less of a Guyanese. It doesn't make you, as some people will say, well, you want to be a national of India. That has been some of the arguments, you know, that has been made before. It adds pride to who you are because it gives you a sense of history. And I think that should also motivate. If you have that sense of history, it should motivate people to go out there and look at the historical records, right? It should motivate people to go into the archive and see if they can find those ship records, right? And trace their ancestors back to India, as many people have been doing and are continuing to do. And hopefully it will motivate people, as we have been, you know, in a sense, arguing for over years now, we've been on record saying that we need those immigration records. We need to have them digitized. They need to be preserved so we can go back. Because once you lose those, records, we don't have the memory because we don't have people still alive, who came on those ships. So if those documents are no longer in existence, then we have lost an important part of our historical evolution or lineage and our connection with India, and so on, because you can't recreate those documents.
So, Mr. Dev, Dr. Ramrat made three important points here. One, the importance of history. That people should know their history of their identity, their survival, where they have come from, the civilization. And the second point he made is that in the Caribbean region, there is African Emancipation Day. At times, well, not at times, historically it was called Emancipation Day, and people really knew what it meant. It meant African Emancipation Day. And now the governments in the region have given a specific identity. It's called African Emancipation Day. Therefore, there should be no problem with having Indian Arrival Day in contrast with African Emancipation Day. Now, in Guyana, it is called Arrival Day. In the other territories, for example, even in Grenada, it's called Indian Arrival Day. In Trinidad and Tobago, it's called Indian Arrival Day. In Suriname, it's not an annual holiday, but every 4 years it is a national holiday, and it's called Indian Arrival Day. In Fiji, last year it became an official annual holiday. It is called Indian Arrival Day. In Mauritius, it is called Indian Arrival Day. In South Africa, it's called Indian Arrival Day. Why not Guyana? Why isn't it called Indian Arrival Day in Guyana? I wonder if you can reflect on that a little.
Well, I think maybe things are about to change. I have thought a lot about that over the years because our group, first the Jaguar Committee for Democracy, then ROAR, we led the fight in Guyana. At that point, it was still called Immigration Day. And the Dharmic Sabha was one institution that...
It was not a holiday.
It was not a holiday, but we fought for it to be a holiday. And I happened to have been elected to Parliament in 2001. And by 2003, the PPP moved a motion in the National Assembly to change the Holiday Act, whatever the official name is. For there were two holidays that needed to be addressed. One was Independence Day. That was not a public holiday, meaning it did not automatically become a holiday. Every year, the minister had to gazette it and it became a holiday. And then the other one was the Arrival Day, and that's how the PPP phrased it, because they were in government. They put the motion to the floor. And in that debate, I made all of the points that we are making at this stage in terms of it ought to be Indian Arrival Day. But the motion was carried by them, and therefore a committee was formed in which I was a member of that committee. I think Mr. Gadraj, later ambassador to India, was the head of that committee. And we then took evidence from the public. And every organization that gave evidence that was for the holiday, they recommended that it be called Indian Arrival Day. I think there was about 6, the Ghana Islamic Trust, there were the Indian Arrival Committee, which had been formed by some PPP individuals. All of them recommended Indian Arrival Day, including, of course, GIA, headed by the inimitable Miss Ryan Shaw, all recommended Indian Arrival Day. But when the committee now was summarizing its findings to present back to Parliament, it noted what I just said. Everybody has recommended that, and they did so too, but they said they had to work within their remit, and therefore they had to put it back that Indian Arrival Day, or Arrival Day ought to be a public holiday. On the floor at that point, it was debated again. People like myself and others spoke up. So having been involved that intimately in it, I've thought a lot about it. And what I felt then, I still felt now, that one of the problems with the PPP, at that point being a Marxist-Leninist party, that was what was on its constitution. Dr. Jagan had made it into, and I guess we will segue into what we ought to be discussing later. In 1969, Dr. Jagan moved that in Congress, and in 1970, their constitution was officially changed to incorporate that they were a Marxist-Leninist party. And that means, therefore, in Marxist-Leninism, race and ethnicity are seen to be what is called epiphenomenon. It is not the real thing, because fundamentally, class is the only definition of oneself that is then accepted. And so my feeling at that point, and somebody who at some point hopefully will talk about it, because they had to have discussed it. They were not living on Mars. And I felt the only reason was that they then felt that to give the word an ethnic, they give the holiday an ethnic meaning, would somehow have them bend their Marxist-Leninist ideology that was in their constitution. Well, today, and hopefully we'll talk about this, at the 32nd Congress that just completed, and it is rather ironic that it was completed on May 5th, 2024, exactly Indian Arrival Day. And I'm hoping that now that Marxism, Leninism has been jettisoned, there will now be no reason ideologically not to accept ethnicity as a factor. In fact, in explaining the expunging of Marxist-Leninism, General Secretary Mr. Bharat Jagdeo explicitly announced that the party will now be able to handle, and I quote, cultural diversity, racial equity, and religious harmony. So these words can now be uttered without the sky falling. And I hope now that with that impediment out of the way that was bequeathed by Dr. Jagan, it will not be seen as heresy to, in 2025, when we're going to have elections, to announce that the day will be Indian Arrival Day. As we know, in Trinidad, it started out as Arrival Day also, but then when Basdeo Pandey entered government, it was changed and remains Indian Arrival Day, and I hope we'll follow in Trinidad's footsteps.
Okay, so Indians started coming to Guyana, then British Guyana, in 1838. Indentureship ended in 1917. That was the last period that recruits came to Guyana in 1917, and indentureship itself ended on January 1st, 1920. Is it 20 or 21, Ravi?
20.
Yeah, so Indian arrival was celebrated through different nomenclatures. It was at one time, as Ravi Dev said, Immigration Day. At one time, it was also called Ramakande. And then through the intervention of people like Ravi Dev, Betram Ramarak, myself, and others, we call it Indian Arrival Day. And it was celebrated in New York in 1984 for the first time. And from then to now, it is also celebrated annually in Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago, and other territories for decades. So anything else before we move on to the PPP Congress that that culminated on May 5th last Sunday?
No, well, Ravi said it quite clearly. The sky will not fall if we put the word Indian in Arrival Day. And I would urge, not to sound arrogant or anything, I would urge every person in Guyana who understands what we're saying, when they refer to Arrival Day, be bold enough to say this is Indian Arrival Day, and they should make some kind of lobbying effort on behalf of a government to which they have been very loyal, right, for generations, to say, look, you took it out, put the word Indian back into it, and it's not gonna, it's not gonna destroy the country if you recognize that.
So let's now begin the discussion on the PPP Congress. First, what is a Congress, and why did the PPP hold a Congress? It could be either one of you. Ravi, since you are based in Guyana, you want to tell us what is a Congress, and why did the PPP hold a Congress?
Well, the People's Progressive Party very early on was inspired by events in India. And that's where the word Congress came out in 1885, that the Indian National Congress was formed. And that has been remarked upon by many people. In fact, in Guyana, there was an Indian National Congress. And interestingly enough, Mr. U.C. Quayana from Buxton was a member and has talked about him being a member of the Indian National Congress. Gandhi was very influential. The Congress was very influential because they were the jewel of the crown, to use a cliche, India that is. And therefore, whatever happened in India redounded through all the colonies, because there was this sharp distinction made between the dominions of England, all the white countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, even South Africa got dominion status, but the others were mere colonies. And as India began to agitate for dominion status in the beginning, that set off, as I said, ripples all the way to Guyana. So when the PPP was formed in 1950, even the PAC, when it was formed by Dr. Jagan as a discussion group, he had and has written in his book, The Western Trial, about the influence that Gandhi and Nehru had on him. So he knew what was going on there. So the word Congress, I think, came out of that. And in fact, as a party, it is the PNC. It is Mr. Burnham who actually chose the word for his party, People's National Congress. It shows you how the word was used. A Congress, of course, is a getting together. You meet in a Congress to deliberate, to discuss, to cogitate, and to come up with ideas and what have you. So that is where the word Congress came in. So when the PPP was launched as a party, it has its congresses. So in fact, when the famous split came about in 1955, Dr. Jagan, in a speech that has become very famous, he couldn't deliver the speech. He was under guard in Joshua. He couldn't move. But the Congress was being held in New Amsterdam, and he made a written speech that had to be delivered by someone else, Bridley Ben, I believe. But I'll be corrected if possible. But that speech, in a sense, led to Mr. Quayana leaving the PPP. It was a very historic speech to that Congress. When Mr. Burnham tried to first split the party and seize leadership, there was a Congress at the Metropole Cinema, which is next to Freedom House. Those who are old enough to, like me, would remember the old Metropole, where our friend Clement Rohi used to look after the bicycles so people didn't steal them. You know, when you in those days you were only traveling with bicycles. Be as it may, Congress is a word that has been around for a long time. So the PPP has continued that tradition through the years of holding its biennial Congress every 2 years. It would hold it, and then the PNC would also come into that, and they would hold the biennial Congresses to do that. So it's not only the PPP has just held theirs. I think the entire Guyana is waiting for the PNC to hold theirs in August, and I think that might also be a seismic event, and we shall get the shock periods. But this one, I think, was a very, 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 very important Congress, and will go down historically as one, because from the very onset of the word Congress and of Dr. Jagan's insertion into the political system of Guyana, he defined himself. He tried to dodge the issue in the beginning, but by 1969, he defined himself as a communist, when he defined the PPP as a communist party, and was a member of the Communist International. And therefore, what has happened in this Congress for the word Marxism, Leninism, and socialism, not even communism, to now be jettisoned, I think is very, very, very epochal. And we should now discuss what might be the possible implications of this.
Professor Crack, any contributions to that?
No, well, I thought this was an interesting Congress. Ravi gave a good historical evolution of it. And it's significant for all of those reasons. But for me, I think what aside from the fact that you're making some serious deletion, so to speak, of some really key words that guided the PPP from its foundation, I think for me, we also have to look at the consequences of that going forward. But what is also important is the extent to how utilizing those ideas and building a movement that was guided, at least at the top leadership position. Um, the extent, to how Guyanese society has changed and evolved since then. And there are a lot of traumatic things that have happened. The fact that the PPP was aligned with this idea, it's not just a belief, but, that belief also led the PPP to align itself with some forces abroad, right, at the international level, which had dire consequences to what we did in Guyana. So at some point, what I'm saying is there has to be some kind of reckoning. What does that all mean? Do we, you can't just simply sit back and say, well, look, this was a historical period, and you have to look at things in context. Yes, context is important, but look at the consequences and the costs, right? In terms of what has happened because of this ideological orientation, which the leadership, and I say leadership, and I want to emphasize that because that is where that concept was. It was within that leadership, and it's important for us to look at that. And I think this is also why, while we're talking about the wars that are being jettisoned, which is why we also look at the way decisions are being made. In the old Soviet Union, you have this small group that comes out of the Congress, right, that evolved into what is called a Politburo. And that Politburo now would now select, right, a person to be the general secretary. So the person who is in charge of the country is also in charge of the political party, right? So there were a lot of things that happened in Russia, for instance, because of that kind of democratic centralism, which the PPP has now said that they're not willing to give up. But in terms of the power structure, that also has its consequences because we can't ignore the fact that the Marxist orientation is one, but you have decades, right, of supporting people like Stalinism, right, because of that ideological orientation. So that aspect of, what the PPP is now evolving into, which obviously is interesting, that also has to be given some kind of thought in terms of the consequences, because people's lives were destroyed because they did not share that philosophy. One of those people who have actually called for those similar changes, I believe about 20 years ago, was a young fellow named Kamraj Ramjatan, right, who suggested that we need to remove these words and they're not appropriate. And he talked about modifying and changing, the structure of how decisions are being made within the PPP. Now, he was ridiculed. And of course, Janet Jagan was a person who shelved those discussions. And we know what the consequences for Ramjatan, because of him being a young person trying to reform, right, or to introduce those similar changes, because one of those suggestions he made was we need to look at those words and try to remove them and change them, right? And also he made proposal in terms of how decisions should be made. Now, the point is, again, alliances were made based on this kind of ideology. I've written a letter in Stabbert News arguing or making the point that because of this ideology, which the leadership, right, which the leadership maintained, that has also led them to become enabler of the dictatorship in Guyana. That's something we can't ignore. You can try to mama guy and try to wiggle your way out and argue against that, but the fact remains that we know critical support, for instance, was based on an ideological collaboration between the PPP and the PNC. So we have to look at the consequences, right, of adopting those ideology and what it has done to the entire society, which we call Guyana. We just can't ignore that. We can't just brush it off today as a historical event that happened, 2 days ago, right? So we have to look at that historical consequences as well as consequences going forward.
So, as Ravidev pointed out, the Congress is a coming together, a get together, holding a discussion on policies and programs of a political. The PPP is in its 74th anniversary since it was founded in 1950. And over the last weekend, for 3 days, May 3rd, 4th, and 5th, it held its 32nd biannual Congress or biennial Congress. The last Congress was held in Essequibo, I think it was 2019, the 31st, and this one was the 32nd. So aside from some what one wouldn't call cosmetic changes, but significant changes during which the terms Marxism, Leninism was removed from the PPP's constitution, what other significant events took place over that Congress, Mr. Dev?
Well, first of all, I don't think it is inconsequential, those changes, because the very fabric of the PPP is intertwined with those words. Marxism, Leninism is supposed to give you a complete worldview. It's an ideology, and it just does not describe the world. It prescribes what you ought to do in that world. And this is why it is so important for us to dissect what those jettisoning those terms mean. We have had, for example, Mr. Donald Ramutar on these programs many times. And in all of his polemics, especially with Dr. Amarak, you could see where he's coming from. And where he's coming from is from a Marxist, Leninist standpoint that Dr. Jagan brought into the party. And we could see from how Mr. Ramutar and Mr. Clement Rohi and others of that era, these young men who were groomed by Dr. Jagan, that they still use Marxism, Leninism, like Mr. Ralph Ramkaran also. They use it as a tool for analyzing the world. So if they were to ask what is going on in Gaza, what is going on in the Ukraine, what is going on in Africa, what is going on in America, and what is going on in Guyana, they will use the Marxist analysis, which is that it is classes, not ethnic groups, that are in fundamental conflict. And the word conflict is very important, that you can't just paper over this class conflict, because that is inevitable. As they would say, they have terms for all of these things. There are contradictions in these relations, and dialectically, and you'll always hear the word dialectically, meaning what I call complex causation. They use a fancy word because nothing is unicausal. Everything has multiple causes, but they will use the term dialectical. And in the dialectics, they see an inevitability of certain outcomes. So when you ask a Marxist a question, let us say, well, why can't we have Indian Arrival Day? Fundamentally, you're asking him to break a principle, because the word Indian or ethnic labels are something outlandish. It's as if you are crazy. You're seeing illusions. Those are not real things because they're not sanctioned by the Marxist approach. Ironically, in dealing with the reality of Russia, our friend Lenin and our friend Stalin, I use the term lightly, when they formed the Soviet Union, they gave all these ethnic groups their own states, united, all their own Soviets. So they dealt with the ethnic question by giving them their own, Soviets, their own states.
Homelands.
And,
Yeah.
and even in the army, you had different units, different ethnic units. So they would not send a Georgian unit to calm a disturbance in Georgia. They would use maybe a Cossack, something different. So the point is, though, in Guyana, we were what C.R. James once called Dr. Jagan a Simon Pure Marxist, where he was the real deal. He didn't compromise. So even Gorbachev, when I spoke to Dr. Jagan in 1989, when I brought him up to New York for the Gopio conference, he saw Gorbachev as compromising, on these essential premises. Because didn't he, Chetty, go to all these meetings in Russia and sit there, not only as an observer, but as a participant? But now the line was being broken. So as late as 89, Dr. Jagan still felt the line had to be held. So to come back to it, I don't want us to just throw out this, this is an inconsequential one. The fact that that's democratic centralism was not also throughout. Now, democratic centralism is a methodology of making decisions that was popularized by Lenin. It was there already. The Germans would use it, but Lenin popularized it. So if you throw out Marxism, Leninism, the ideology that explains the world, and you don't throw out democratic centralism, the mechanism to make decisions about changing the world, you have what they would call a contradiction. And that contradiction is going to arise in the future, I believe, earlier rather than later, because you now have, this is the contradiction. We have heard now we will have pluralism. Maybe it is like Mao said in 1957, let 100 flowers bloom. In fact, that's the quotation, right? He never said 1,000. He said, let 100 flowers bloom. Let there be different opinions known. But in democratic centralism, you can only have differences of opinion within the party, within the group. You can't go outside. If you dare utter it outside, then you will, like Comrade Rambutan, will be eventually thrown out. And in fact, there's a constant argument that when Mao in 1957 used let 100 flowers bloom, and all the intelligentsia started talking about differences of how we can modify things, most of them were executed. So they felt Mao really used it as a ruse to identify those who would go against him. And you check the history, they were mostly executed by Mao himself. So to come back to Guyana, I'm hoping there will be no executions in Guyana, but I do predict that all these differences, now that we say we are a pluralist society, we will accept differences of opinion. But by having democratic centralism, it means that you can't talk about it outside. That'll be a contradiction, and I see some problems coming out there. Because I see the old guard, who are still Marxist-Leninists, are all in the party. My friend Donald is there. My friend Clement Rohi, I hope he doesn't mind me calling him his friend. But they're all there. All of them are still there. I understand they were there to give some old heads to guide the younger ones. Well, let's see what happens.
Well, I hope you're about pluralism within Guyana in each of the political parties. Aside from Marxism, Leninism being jettisoned from the PPP constitution, the Congress is also the period of time when the party elects its central leadership. It's called the Central Committee. Dr. Ramark made reference to the Politburo. It's similar. So you have the Central Committee is elected, and the delegates who attend the Congress, I think there were about 3,000 of them, elected the Central Committee. And then the following day, the Central Committee met and elected the Executive Committee, in addition to the General Secretary, the person who is actually the leader of the political party. Dr. Ramark, you care to comment on any of those and the remarks made by Ravindra Dev?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to dodge your question, but there's a couple of things that's just spinning in my head, and I just want to get it out. For us, let me just say, yes, there are some diehard Marxists, and Ravi mentioned some names. Um, and again, one of the things we try to do here is to share an appreciation for history, right? And history can't just stay in your head; it has to be out there, because it helps us to understand, who we are and where we're going, because we're talking about the way forward here. Ralph Ramkaran would be one of those persons. In fact, Ralph Ramkaran, because the Jagans were, in a sense, loyal, they drew their ideological inspiration, and this is all documented, not me saying this, from a fellow named Billy Strachan in England. He was a Jamaican but lived in England. Um, and they were, in a sense, grooming
Secretary,
Ralph Ramkaran.
Secretary of the British Communist Party.
Exactly. So they were grooming Ralph Ramkaran to replace Chet. In fact, he was the person who recommended um, yeah, Barnum to be second in command of the PPP, right? So there's a strong connection, and everything that the PPP has done, especially Janet and Chetty, was to connect with him and seek his advice. And again, this is not me saying this. You can find this documented in archival record. I think the person who helped to build UG, Harold Drayton, talks a bit about this, and how the party was controlled by that clique, especially Janet, right? And how her ideological approach to things influenced the decisions she made. So I know Clement Rohi was mentioned. He's one of those old guards. Rohi, he's a very active blogger in Starbuck News. He uses a name, Rakhi Sang. It's there, and he has taken pot shots against President Irfan Ali and VP Bara Jagdev. That information is there if anybody is willing to check that out. So it shows that even within the Marxist ideology, sometimes a bright light shines, and they can't avoid that, so they have to take shots at where they think that this path, right, this ideological path is leading. And of course Donald would be one nice guy, one of those guys who, but the point is, if you're influenced by a Marxist ideology and you're being trained, uh, you know, and being taught all your life that race is an epiphenomenon, right? It's gonna disappear under Marxism and socialism. It means that you're only seeing divisions based on class. And this is one of the things that I've pointed out, that you're looking at those people who may have some wealth in their hand. They are now the enemies. The concern is not how those people were able to earn their wealth, right? But the concern is, how are you going to destroy them and try to make things equal, right? Or share things equitably or equally. So that's a fundamental problem, because those who are Marxists see society from a class perspective, and it means that you're giving ethnic divisions, racial considerations short shrift. It means you're not paying enough of an attention to that to try to resolve or try to contain that issue, right? Now, the other thing I do have to point out is, yes, there are Marxists. Some people have used Jagan's Marxism as what is called a vulgar Marxism. In other words, he believed exactly in terms of what the slogan says, what the language of Marxism is all about, because he has used many of those slogans, right? Aside from the fact that he was very closely aligned with the Soviet Union. The point I'm trying to make here is, you can be a Marxist, and there were many Marxists, but you also have Marxists like those who would support the PPP. And again, I'm talking about Rohi, Dana Ramatar, and then previously, I guess, Ralph Ramkaran. They're looking at things from a Marxist perspective. Well, Rodney was also a Marxist, but Rodney understood. He understood his history. He wrote about Black history. He talked about Black history. He understood the nuances, right, of Marxism. When you combine that with a historical approach to look at the existence of African people. So that understanding was there, but we don't see that coming from the other side, right? We don't see that fundamental understanding that, yes, you can talk about Marxism, but let's also consider ethnic division and racial division and so on as also important. It's not going to disappear, but if you spend your life thinking that, well, it's a class analysis and you want to blame the Europeans for something that happened so many years ago, we're now, generations ahead, and we're still talking about that as if it's an external problem or was caused by an external, force, which is true. The point is you're not spending time enough to address that issue. And the last point I do want to make is that, if we're going to talk about the changes, and hopefully you will see changes coming from this new dispensation, so to speak, right, with the jettisoning of all of these, Marxist concept, then what we need to focus on, hopefully, is that a recognition that Guyana is a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, and we need to come up with policies that will address that. My fear is that when we talk about one Guyana, again, it's a good concept, but it's not new, right? When we talk about one Guyana, in some people's mind, that sounds like, well, we have to give up our historical lineage, right? Our ethnicity. So culture is not important. We have to give up all of those things to become, this one Guyanese, right? In the United States, we talk about being American. That's a concept that has to do with being a citizen, right? But they're Afro-Americans, they're Italian-Americans, and so on. That doesn't necessarily take away from the kind of society that we live in, right? It's expressing your cultural, background, but at the same time, you're being Guyanese. So I think that concept has been misunderstood by those who promote this whole Marxist culture, this Marxist philosophy. So hopefully going forward, if you're now saying that we're going to jettison all of these concepts, then maybe we ought to look and approach, let's say, like what you have in Canada, for instance, right? You have a multicultural ministry that is, well, you have a sort of a multicultural policy that is geared towards looking at how other groups benefit and to ensure that every other groups benefit. So that means you're taking cultural background, you're taking ethnicity into consideration, because those contentions still exist. We are still a divided society on the basis of race, right, and ethnicity, right? Of course, we're divided on the basis of class too. But this would be a great opportunity, I think, to come up with multicultural policies, right, that would give recognition to the fact that we are one Guyana, but we should have unity in diversity because we're made up of different ethnic communities. I don't know if you guys were hearing me.
Yeah, we heard you.
Yeah. Are you hearing me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So Ravi, you want to comment, but Dr. Ramrat?
Well, I think the fellow who looks at the glass half full, not half empty. I think the PPP has made a bold move here. It's a start. Even I understand that even the Christians say God took 7 days to create the world. He didn't do it in one fell swoop. But in the beginning was the Word, I am told. And we have had the word, that those two terms, which are tremendously significant in their import, that have been gone. So it's not just the words, it's what those words mean. So when the General Secretary, who was re-elected unanimously, when he now says that the goal is to create a fair and equitable society that has cultural diversity, he is acknowledging Dr. Ramrat's plea there. He talks about racial equality. So here again, there's no fear now to talk about race and racial equality and religious harmony. That I don't think has ever been disputed. People will argue whether Dr. Jagan was an atheist or not. That's, I think, irrelevant. He never talked about impinging upon the opium of the masses. He allowed them their opium. for a while, which is what the Marxists would say religion is. But to come back to how do we get there, I think this is where we will have to take the PPP at its word. More importantly, those who are within the PPP, those who were elected to the PPP, both the Central Committee and the Executive Committee, they will have to take the struggle further in eking out the meaning of those terms in reality. What does it mean outside of the word? First was the word. Well, how is the word going to be implemented? So let us take, for example, racial equality, right? There is, from the opposition, a constant drumbeat that there is not racial equality. I think that the PPP will have to come out, for instance, in its programs to show that it is working towards racial equality. And that has to be shown by the numbers. The numbers wouldn't lie. So as we have called for since we came on the scene back in the late 80s, early 90s, we're saying they ought to be ethnic impact statements on programs that will be questioned from an ethnic perspective, whether we like it or not. The Indians did it during Burnham days. When Burnham said he will buy all the paddy up, bought the paddy cheaply, created rice mills and silos that he gave to his own people, milled the paddy, sold the rice expensively, spent the profits on all kinds of wild goose projects in Georgetown and elsewhere. Indians questioned it, his policies, right? When he put the sugar levy and Indians couldn't get any profit sharing that was given to them by arbitration in 1968. Indians questioned that because for once, you could buy something. My father worked on the sugar plantation his whole life. The first time we got what is called a three-piece set, a little three-piece thing with leatherette, fake leatherette, much less leather, was at this what they call once for all. So each of Burnham's policies, when he brought in the External Trade Bureau and start to import all goods through the government and gave the goods to the KSI that was only in African areas. So the small shopkeeper was stifled. Indians questioned it. You understand? So what will happen now to come to the present with the PPP's policies in having articulated it and having no excuse now not to use racial categories, should put out that, okay, we gave out 30,000 house lots. How many of them are for Africans, Indians, Chinese, mixed, what have you? Let that be one of the criteria when you fill out a form, like in America here. Whenever I go for my medical treatment in New York, they put your ethnicity, you put there. And therefore, the data can then be disaggregated and then presented to show you are building an equitable society. I happened to run in the other day with a big one on this gold program, the one where all the scholarships are being given out. And I asked him, I said, man, how is the distribution? And he said, African Guyanese are participating more than Indian Guyanese in getting those scholarships. Now, I think those scholarships are critical because they are preparing people, Guyanese for the new economy. The new economy is not going to cut it with just planting rice by hand like I did when I was a kid. The new economy is going to have drones planting rice and drones shining fertilizer and so on and so forth. So I think they'll be more prepared. When you talk of all the training for women, look at the optics. But the PPP now, like I said, it doesn't have the albatross of Marxism around its neck anymore. It can now say, okay, we're gonna let ethnic figures come out. And I hope they do so for the good of Guyana, because from my own observation, I don't believe that there is that kind of ethnic discrimination. Now, my friend Nigel Hughes has brought up the point that you have all these contracts going to Indians or Indian firms, but as a horse of a whole different color. There's a bidding system. If you pick up the Ghanaian newspapers physically like I do, half of those newspapers every day are filled with advertisement for calling for bids on every project under the sun. So you bid. Now there may be some problems with the what we call it, the outfit that evaluates bids, and that is something that must be fixed. But that's where we can work. So coming back to your question, Vishnu, I feel that the PPP has now opened up another can of worms. I think it has opened up the spigot of democracy in the pluralist sense, where to ask these questions would not be a betrayal of the party. And I expect more individuals from within the PPP, not people like myself who may be seen as a critic, but not the critic, seen as a critic, might be seen as that. I hope it'll happen, and let 100 flowers bloom without plucking their heads off.
No, back to the concept of Marxism. You would recall, both of you and myself and others, who were involved in the struggle from 1968 to 1992 for the restoration of democracy in Guyana. And we were very critical and calling for an end to this whole idea of Guyana being a Marxist-Leninist, a socialist, communist state. We were heavily criticized, critiqued, attacked, excoriated, abused for it. Do you have any commentary on that? I mean, is it poetic justice? Is it a complete reversal of what those positions taken by the government and our opposition to it?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was involved in today. I made a comment about the fact that we have to go back and look at our history, and one of the person who responded said, well, basically, and he invoked the name of Balaram Singh Rai, and he used the word Apanjat. So he's saying Rai was an Apanjat. So therefore, he wasn't thinking of all Guyana, he was thinking of Indians. So therefore, people didn't vote for him. Yeah, that is such a travesty of a sort of a, I don't want to call him names, I'm not going to mention his name, but it's such a miseducation, misunderstanding. But my point here is that because of that ideology, and I come back to the point I made earlier, that ideology had consequences when it was being foisted. So we can't just say, look, they're moving ahead, they're putting that behind. And I want to come back to Rai, because I did a study on Rai, and again, to show you the consequences of that ideology, right? Where if you were not a Marxist, or if you were not with the PPP at that time, by the same token, if you were not with the PNC, then you are in a boat by yourself. So the thing about Rai is he stood up. And again, this comes back to this whole question of ethnicity. You have now opened up, this sort of a, perestroika, so to speak, where you're now allowing people to express their ethnic sentiments. So the question with Rai was that he was not a Marxist, but he did stood up for Indians. We talk about ethnic impact statement. Well, I will go one step further. We need to talk about, balancing institutions, right? Getting more Amerindians, more Indians into the civil service, into the armed forces, into the police. If we're creating an air force, we need to have every community, share that burden, right? So to come back to the point I was making about, how Marxism has been used to destroy a person. Here's a guy who had said that we need to balance the forces. He recognized that. But now you can have a narrative that came out of that era that says that guy is a racist because he advocated for having a balanced force. Here's the thing about when he was fired, the PPP now, well, before he was fired, there was an election that was being held. Again, this is the damage that this ideology has created. There was an election for party chairperson. And if people don't know the history, I've written about it. So Mr. Rai, who represented that Indian voice, right, who had that concern for Indian security, he wasn't a racist. He was a good friend with Quayana. They ran in the 1957 election. They shook hands after the election was over. But Rai was expelled because what the PPP had done is that they interfered with their election to make sure that a black figure, right, Brinley Horatio Ben, would be the party, the person next in charge of the PPP, because understandably, the PPP wanted to show that multicultural face. So here's the thing. Brinley Ben accused Janet Jagan of trying to control the party because of her Marxist notion and that's whole idea of democratic centralism, right? He accused Chetty of being too soft. And this was the person who said, you can't stop communism, but you can stop tomorrow. See, he was more of a radical. He left the PPP despite that. He flirted with the WPA. He formed his own Marxist party, right? And he left. But here we have a person who served the PPP as two ministers, Home Affairs and Education, was denied his pension. But because he was not a Marxist, because he challenged a Marxist political party, he was not given his pension, or attempts were not being made to rectify that issue, despite him, addressing that problem over the years with Chetty. Chetty passed his letter on to Luncheon. Nothing came out of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that Marxism trumps everything else. Brinley Ben was treated that way because A, he was black, he was African, which is understandable because you want to show that the party is multi-ethnic. But the problem was he shared a political ideology, Marxism, right, with the PPP. That's why he was treated that way. So the point again I'm trying to make, and I know I've made this over and over, is that Marxism had its consequences in the past, and we have to recognize that, right? And the fact that we are now seeing that we can move forward, we're going to see the change. Ethnic impact statement is one, but we also want to see institutional changes that would recognize that Guyana is a multi-ethnic society, and if that is the trajectory, right, that the PPP is moving, then they also need to understand that those institutions have to reflect the population of the country, right, and that is crucial and that is important. And lastly, I just want to say that we keep coming back to this whole notion of ethnicity. Right, we keep talking about that, and we're seeing that the windows are opening up to have that kind of discussion. If we're going to discuss one Guyana, right, which is a good thing to do, at the same time, we also have to recognize the fact that we are a multi-ethnic society, and we need to give credence to those kinds of narrative that are coming from different organizations that represent those communities. And I'm going to end by saying this. The problem with trying to move forward and trying to address those issues of multiculturalism that we're talking about is my fear is that today we don't, because of that history, we don't have very strong Indian voices or Indian organizations. Mr. Dev is a loner in Guyana. We don't have prominent, solid Indian organizations that can say, look, if we're going to talk about ethnicity, then this is my voice. I'm contributing my narrative to this national narrative and this debate. So we're not there, right? You look at Epology, you've got almost 80 organizations, that have that interest intact, right? In different areas. We don't necessarily have that. And I think it is a danger for us, or especially those who are concerned about having that Indian voice articulated, to leave that alone, leave that responsibility on the lap of the PPP. And I think that that will be problematic because
Okay,
we've seen, you know.
Mr. Dev, Dr. Ram give a very nice summary. You have any final points?
Yeah, I think we can see some progress. To his credit, Dr. Jagan and several of us have asked him about the Ben Singh debacle, which our friend Fenton Ramsahoy concluded by saying the party works in mysterious ways.
Devious. He said, I think he said devious.
I prefer mysterious ways that to solve it. But to come to the point, what Dr. Jagan obviously was trying to do, as he did when he formed the first PPP, while he was a Marxist, he yet genuflected because he knew he had to ethnicity by forming a PAC that had everybody in. Hubbard was white, near white. There was a Chinese guy, I forget his name right now. You had brought in Burnham when Chase was the African face. So you had ethnic voices there, ethnic representation. So when comes 1962 and we talk of voting for the chairman of the PPP, Dr. Jagan and he was very upset that he wasn't seen in a credible light, that he was trying to put an African, therefore, as a Marxist, he was going against his Marxist instincts to put an African Marxist. Beto might say, well, he was a Marxist, and that was the clincher. It was not really. Dr. Jagan in the Western trial says, without any sense of irony, that if Sidney King had not left, he would have been the chairman of the PPP. So the point is, he wanted an African. The irony, of course, he didn't see himself as arrogating to himself that he was an Indian leader, because he never saw himself as an Indian. But he didn't realize that from the outside, everyone else saw him as an Indian, and that had its own consequences. Well, I guess, like I said, I look at the glass half full. And when you look at this Congress that just occurred, even though the PPP, to use a basketball term, was giving the African Guyanese population the full court press to get them into joining up with the PPP, did everything but stand on their head. And some places they probably did stand on their head. But if you look at the Congress, there weren't that many African groups there. It means, therefore, that they did not try to jimmy up something to bring in African groups, because to be a PPP group, they have their own rules. You have to be in existence for X number of years. You have to have paid membership, all kinds of rules that you had to obey. So it implies that they did not, in a sense, try to do what Dr. Jagan did, just to get some black faces. So when you now look at the EXCO, the executive committee, every one of them is an Indian. Dr. Jagan did everything to prevent that. So it means that this is a much more comfortable PPP leadership with how ethnicity plays out in the party. Because, for example, there was a huge delegation from the Amerindian areas inside. Again, you can go by the optics in the pictures in the paper. That means, and I happen to know, that there have been a lot of mobilization in the hinterland, and so there's a lot of genuine Amerindian groups. Going to PPP, it made a full court press on them also, but they're willing to have joined up much earlier. So they became authentic groups. You have Amerindian groups who came to Congress. I think at the next Congress, you will see more African Guyanese groups, because those who are working with them will do that, and maybe that will have some input into the outcome. So here again, I want to say this, that the PPP has unleashed a process that has consequences that they really can't predict, because it's a new Guyana. people are developing much more confidence as they get jobs. It's the same dynamic that the PPP is creating by giving out all these 20,000 gold contracts. Those people are now beginning to think. They're project managers, they're engineers, they're, the rural Indian never ever had that kind of exposure. I don't care who tells me what. This is the first time the rural Indian who forms the base of the PPP are being given the opportunity to really educate yourself. Because look how long UG is all the way out on the East Coast. When I was a boy, you had to schlep all the way from IFLA to UG. Ain't gonna happen. Ain't gonna happen. So I think, again, I want to say with all honesty that I think the PPP has made a good beginning, and I think all Guyanese need to put their backs to the wheel to assist them in whichever way they can in terms of persuading them to let the true meaning of what they have said in pluralism play out. Lastly, and I'll conclude on this, which is that on the economic front, so you have Jefferson Marxist-Leninism, which has a theory, and based on the theory of economics and how the economic wealth is to be shared. Now, the General Secretary also said their party is going to be much more au fait with the present dispensation, which is a neoliberal dispensation. And this is something I've been talking until my face is getting blue. I wasn't like this. I used to be very fair a few months back, but in talking about this, you talk to them blue in the face here, that both parties, the PNC and the PPP, need to talk about their economic system based on where they are. We don't want to repeat the mistake. Whether we like it or not, we have a new Cold War between the United States of America and China. It's a new Cold War, and your actions will have consequences, just as it did for Dr. Jagan. It will have consequences now. And I would like to believe that this is part of the reason for the PPP jettison in Marxism-Leninism. So it's not seen as part of a pink wave, but as a red wave in Latin America. So I believe that on the economic front, the groups in Guyana, especially those who feel they are locked out, under this new dispensation, there ain't going to be much handouts, because the new dispensation under this so-called the free enterprise system is that you are supposed to develop your entrepreneurial spirit, because it is through that entrepreneurial spirit that you will then develop yourself. But in developing yourself, you will then become rich, but the country will become rich. Hence, you have even a communist China having more billionaires than America. More billionaires in China than in America, because you have to let 1,000 economic billionaires flower. Thank you.
Well, that'll be the final word. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. We'll end the discussion now. Thank you and good night to all.